Here we go. Welcome to the Lion in Zion, coming at you on this Wednesday afternoon. I'm here in southern Israel, speaking to you from the front lines of, I don't even know what to say. It's the center of the world. Everybody wants to know what's going on here. Everybody. Size of, what, New Jersey? A little less than that. What, a population of 9 million people, and nobody can stop talking about us. They can't. They won't. And it makes sense. I'm not surprised. It plays into the whole Jewish narrative, doesn't it? The whole story. If it's not Jews, it's not news, as they say. But I wanted to speak about today about something that's very important, because it is something that I think is becoming or metastasizing. I'm sure you heard it already, but it really requires a good threshing. Zionism is not anti-Zionism, is not anti-Semitism. That's what we're hearing. I don't have a problem with Jews. I have a problem with just the Zionists. And we're hearing this more and more and more. And it's a fig leaf, completely ridiculous. These people are the new Jew haters of today. It's just the same hate, different epoch. It would be like, to me, the equivalent of saying, I don't hate Jews, I just hate their Talmud. I don't like Talmudists, okay? Talmudists are the problem. We're going to burn Talmudists. We're going to burn those books. If you convert to Christianity, it doesn't matter. See, then you're part of my whole thing. Until you have an Inquisition where you have Moreno Jews, and then you basically start having selective who's the good Jew, Christian Jew, convert, and who's not. So that's the new hate today. This is what we're living, and it really needs to be called out. It's becoming very, very popular, and it's basically the modern mutation of an age-old protean hate. As I've heard before, but I'll say it in my own words, they hated us first for our faith. They hated us then for our genetics. And now they're hating us because of our politics, our national identity. So one's a religious identity, one's a racial, ethnic identity, and one now is a political sovereign identity. It just so happens to be very convenient now that we've reestablished a state for the first time in 2 millennia that this new sort of form hates. It's not a hard thing to fathom why this new mutation has occurred, with Jews now sovereign in Israel. Once again, so we hear a lot. It's like, I don't understand how there's these definitions that constantly are evolving and changing, and who's defining it. It's not hard. Jewish identity is not as simple as a lot of other identities. Being Jewish is both being an ethnic faith and an ethnicity and a national identity. The Jews became a nation in Egypt, and they became a religion on Mount Sinai. Okay, and then we became a people when Joshua led us into the land. So there are multiple vectors to Jewish identity, therefore multiple forms of hatred. Wow, it's so shocking. Can you compete? Does that compute? Can you follow the bouncing ball? So I think that where we need to start is really what is modern Zionism, because it's important to say what's modern Zionism, or some people call political Zionism, the Zionism of a Herzl or a Jabotinsky or a Hada'am, or as I should say, Asher Ginsburg, as opposed to a biblical Zionism, right? They're not opposed to each other at all. It's just one was basically the modern form of the Herzl Jabotinsky is part of that is a program of how to actually get that liberation to happen. So it's a little bit more political in its sort of ideation, because it was the actual practical program of bringing Jews back to their land and building up a nation state. So what is Zionism? Very simply, it's the idea of a national liberation belief that the Jews should be self-determined on the land of their ancestors. And so it would make sense, if you don't believe that the Jews should be self-determined and they should have no self-determination or no right to it, that would be a form of Jew hatred. Now, you may say Jews also don't form to Zionism, but they wouldn't say that the Jews don't have a right to it. A lot of the Jews that say, I'm not a Zionist because I think maybe Jews shouldn't be perverted with the taint of politics and having an army and having to deal with all those things. They like this sort of, pure minority status, exilic Jewish identity. Whereas somebody says, no, the Jews don't have a right because they're not a people, therefore they have no right to self-determination. That's a form of hatred. Also, using anti-Zionism before the state when the Jews were in exile and you had various forms of understanding of what it would entail to bring the Jews back and all the ramifications of it. You had Jews that said, maybe we shouldn't. We're just happy here, right, as it is in the exile. So I think that that's a bit of a, how should I say, a twisting of what anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is basically the belief that Jews in no form or no understanding can have the right to self-determination in the land of their ancestors. What I do want to add to this part is that it's not like the Jews just came and no Jews were living in Israel or Palestine, if you want to call it, before 1948 or even 1880, when you start seeing the first modern sort of migrations to Israel, the first yeshuvas, they say. There's always been Jews in Israel, okay? There have been 13 different occupying forces between the Roman exile and the Roman occupation and the reconstitution of Israel in 1948. None of them, by the way, were called Palestine or ruled by a country or a nation called Palestine. And despite these 13 occupiers, there's always been a Jewish population. We find archaeology evidence of Jews living in a vibrant community in Gaza, for instance. We have a synagogue excavated in the 6th century. We find a deep connection of Jewish continuous living in Hebron. We have a deep continuous living in Jerusalem. I think there's census data that comes out from the English in the 19th century that shows that the Jews were one of, if not the biggest population of the different groups in Jerusalem at that time. You have Sfat, or Safed, if you want to call it like that. There, Beersheba, there were some Jewish populations. So it's not like there was no Jews and then Jews came. That's not the picture. But they came in mass from the 1880s on. One of the things that we like to hear is in terms of just, and this might be tangential, but it's important to say, is that they like to quote Herzl talking about using the word colonial enterprise. Colonialism back then wasn't a nasty word. It was Herzl using it as a word like anybody else to describe what kind of operation he was talking about, bringing Jews back to their homeland. So it was the way to be able to describe like a startup, using common lexicon of how do you use a startup or a lean startup, growth patterns. That's how they talked about colonial, being able to do what they were doing was using colonial terminology. It wasn't to describe a colonialist actual mission, because the Jews have always wanted to go back to Israel. There's a culture that sort of reinforces this drive to return, and we'll get into that. So that's the definition of Zionism: the modern Advent and the biblical Zionism of Abraham and the Patriarchs. That's something that's in the DNA of Jews. So the question really is, before we get into how you can't separate Zionism from Judaism, which I think is really important for us to go through, and I'm going to take that time to do it, is why is this happening now, right? So I mentioned that there's an independent Jewish state, so therefore hating Jews for their politics or their national identity definitely seems appropriate. I think that there's some theological aspects to it. The Jews, from an Augustinian perspective, should be downtrodden. From a Muslim possession, also accursed people who rejected their prophets. Them reconstituting sovereignty and then becoming a world-class economy and military power, influential on the global scene. This sort of kind of destroys that narrative, doesn't it? And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, especially real believers who look at the Jews as a false narrative and a people that should be downtrodden. So I think there's a theological aspect to it. By the way, there's plenty of Christians and Muslims that don't think that, but there is definitely a current that can't be ignored. I also think just from looking at Jews in the neighborhood in the Middle East, we lived for thousands of years as second-class citizens. So seeing them not as second-class citizens, but just people that are now in places of influence and dominating on the economic and the political and the military, it just rankles. You're not used to seeing a powerful Jew, a Jew that unapologetically, unabashedly is a Jew and doesn't have to think about or look over his shoulder. Makes people uncomfortable. So I think that's one of the definitely a threat as well within the Middle Eastern neighborhood. And I think you're also seeing an Islamic revival, right, from the post-Ottoman, last 100 years in the post-Ottoman age. There's been sort of it's laid dormant, but we're seeing with the end of the Sykes-Picot arrangement and the rise of jihadism, whether it's Wahhabism, whether it's ISIL or ISIS, or pick your shade of black. There is definitely a revival of hardcore Islamism, and a definite political jihadism that's taking root. And I think that that's just a reaction to 100 years of being dispossessed and feeling like the Western powers had been dominating, and this is their way of getting back. And I think a sovereign Jewish state in the middle of this does not bode well. So I think those are the reasons why. But really what's important here is what this forces upon us, the Jews, dealing with this new canard of, I don't have a problem with Jews, just Zionists. It's not just understanding the definitions and understanding whys, but it's what? The idea that they can separate the two, Zionism and being Jewish or Judaism, it's so ridiculous. It's so beyond the pale. It just shows how absolutely ignorant the people who are saying this are. I mean, it's kind of the wonderful thing when people are not walking the straight truth and justice. They reveal themselves. They can't not reveal themselves. So the fact that they believe that there's a basic difference between Zionism and Judaism just shows that, because Judaism is replete with Zionism, and if they like to use those Haredis, they're Zionists. They just have a different timeline. Those guys who are against Israel with the black hats and the Strimals and the Peyot, they don't actually have a problem with the notion of Jews being sovereign in Israel. They actually are planning on it. They just see it as something that has to come in a certain sequence of events, and they don't see that with this. So don't use them as your fig leaf. That's not going to work. And if you're going to go to the modern equivalents of non-Jewish Zionists that created, that's also not going to work. They were standing on the shoulders of giants. The reason their message was able to resonate so well is because it's in the DNA, cultural DNA of Jews. And I'm going to break it down for you just because, it's important to put out what we know and what's out there as the truth, so that nobody can deny that they don't have an ability to know the truth. But really what it forces us to do is that Jews need to basically educate themselves. We need to go back to the basics. We need to go to our roots and under ourselves so we can address somebody who would say something that ignorant. We can't address ignorance with ignorance. Jews that are basically unable to make full sentences to what their culture is about, what their tradition holds dear, they're not going to be able to provide an advocacy for Zionists, and they won't be able Zionism. And they won't be able to, and they'll be easily, how should I be turned or used as a fig leaf for those who do believe that, saying, "Oh, look, here's Jews that they themselves think it." No, ignorance is not going to be able to combat ignorance. So it requires us to be somewhat educated. So the basic idea is Zionism is into the very fabric of authentic Jewish identity, and like I said, it just shows the level of ignorance of people who are throwing out this ability to say that there's a separation between being Jewish and being a Zionist, or Judaism and Zionism. So I'm going to start very clearly, and you've heard this a couple of people. This is the basic identity of Judaism and the Jewish tradition is based on a triangle, 3 legs: the Torah, the nation, and the land, the Aretz, the and the Torah. Okay, these 3 are the basic fabrics of Jewish culture, tradition, and religion. We can start very clearly with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's say the first commandment given to the first Jew was to Abraham, and it says, Lech lecha, go away from where you are, which was Mesopotamia, the superpower of the age, and go to a land that I will promise to your descendants. Okay, so the first commandment to the first Hebrew is to go and live in Canaan. Okay, Canaan, as we say in the American lexicon, or the Promised Land. Okay, so that's just like the first thing off the bat. The idea of a brit, the idea of a covenant, which is what the Jewish understanding of its relationship with God is, a covenantal relationship, is that I'm setting forth to you the law, you practice the law, and as part of that, what will be the blessing. And if you see it with Abraham, you see it with Isaac, you see it with Jacob, the land and your descendants will be given. So it's part of the very covenantal understanding of Judaism. Are we following the bouncing ball? If you look at the stories of Abraham, he lives in Mesopotamia, he's in Canaan, he goes down to Egypt, and then he goes back to Canaan. So he sees both the 2 superpowers of the age, but where does he end up living and dying, buying a plot for him to be buried in Hebron? It's in the Holy Land, okay? And there's actually a land contract at the end of his life to bury his wife. He pays top dollar for it, just to make sure that this is part of the whole conversation, that this is recognized and written down for posterity. Isaac never leaves the land. He redigs the wells of his father. He argues with the residents of that land, actually the Plishtim, or the Philistines of the age, which are, by the way, Phoenician offshoots of Phoenicia. So they're not even part of the Canaanite tribes of the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Gibeonites. They're not even part of those nations, which is really hilarious to me. So Isaac also never leaves the land. And then he has Jacob. Jacob has to go to Laban, which is Laban, we say in American lexicon. I love the American translation of it, or English translation. And he works for 20 odd years, and he comes back. And then he has to go down to Egypt. But what does he say before he ends his life? He makes Joseph promise him that he will bury him with his fathers. And Joseph takes him back. And Joseph does the same thing. He makes sure that he himself will get buried in the land of Israel. Why? Why do these people care about the land so much? These people that are considered the fathers and the leaders of the Jewish people in its earliest age. Then Moses, right? The Promised Land. I mean, most of this book is the sadness of Moses basically leading a people for 40 years, liberating them, giving them the law from God, and begging to go in the land, but not being able to go into that, but begging and praying. It's the only time you actually hear in the Bible God says, "Stop praying to me." It's not going to happen. And then we have the book of Joshua, which describes the entire conquest of that land. Okay, so the idea of the land and its importance within the Jewish history and tradition and religion, it's not even. I'm going to go on. I mean, this is stuff. I can keep going and going. It's so unbelievable that you think that you, meaning these people that think that they can separate these notions and so that they can comfortably hate Jews. It's obscene. It just shows the level of ignorance. Okay, so we've gone through the Patriarchs, we've gone through Joseph and Moses and Joshua, but let's see the Torah itself. The Torah itself is 613 commandments for Jews, and of these 600 eternal commandments, many of them are agricultural laws that could only be done in Israel. So the land is very important for you to even follow the Torah itself. Okay, I'll give you one. There's Shemitah, which is what basically every 7th year you have to lead the land. You can't cut and harvest. You have to let the land breathe a little bit. That you can only do in Israel. There's also bringing the first fruits, Bikurim. This is only things you can do in Israel. The idea of sacrifices, the idea of a temple itself in Jerusalem, which the Jews believe there will be a third temple. Read Ezekiel. What is that? We're going to build it in what? We're going to build it in, I don't know, we're going to build it in Tucson, Arizona. Is that where it's going to be? Because we don't care about where it actually is. The idea that there's pilgrimage holidays, 3 pilgrimage holidays where you're supposed to go to the temple, to Jerusalem, and Jews today still will go on those 3 times, whether it's Shavuot, whether it's Passover or Sukkot, they will go to Israel, okay? And it's 3 pilgrimage holidays. It's like the Hajj. It's like saying there's a Hajj, but you don't really need Mecca. Who cares if it's Mecca or it's, like I said, it's, in Oklahoma or something. The idea of the Talmud, read stories where you'd have Talmudic rabbis who would come from Babylon, and the moment they would get to the land, they'd roll in the dust. There's lines in the Talmud that will say a Jew that lives in Israel, it's like he's kept the entire Torah. Okay? There's also the idea that this is not the first time Jews have come back. We've done this before. Read the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra, where we reconstitute the Jewish people. We rebuild the Torah. We re-educate them. This has happened before. So that's a tradition of revival in the national spirit. This has happened before. Again, follow the bouncing ball. You can try to ignore it, but it's all there for everybody to look at. I'll go even further. Look at the synagogue. It's every synagogue around the world, whether it's even in Israel or outside of Israel, is facing Israel, and then those in Israel facing Jerusalem. You've set up what is like basically a microcosm of what the temple should look like. So you have the Torah, you have Kohanim that are and Levites that are participating within the service in the synagogue. The prayer service itself, which comes from the first assembly, the Knesset Gadol, the big Knesset that was formed by Ezra and Nehemiah. They built out the prayer service to replicate the services that were going on during the temple times. We actually do recite the sacrificial prayers, and we use our lips as a replacement for the actual sacrifice. So, and then you read the Haggadah on every Seder. Seder being one of the oldest continuous rituals kept in mankind. And at the end it says, Basha'ah haba'ah b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Okay? And it's been said for thousands of years by Jews for that place. But again, there's no connection, right, between Zionism and Judaism and Jewish identity. So again, I'm gonna come back here where I started. These are arguments by the ignorant. These are arguments by Jew haters that want to feel comfortable hating Jews. To me, it's the same thing as I don't have a problem with Jews. I have a problem with Zionists. It's the same thing as I don't have a problem with Jews. I just have a problem with Talmudists. Okay, they're interchangeable, just different, same hate, different epoch, different era. It's the same thing. It's a fugazi. Dennis Prager said something. And I hope, prayers with him to a speedy recovery. But he said something, nobody except really the Nazis really just hated Jews in totality. It's not how it works, okay? It's a very rare thing to, actually just hate somebody completely. Anti-Semitism isn't just like this, comes with horns and a black cape and I hate Jews and then, no, it's always just picking apart a part of the Jews, that part of the Jews. You can still be an anti-Semite and, appreciate some things about being Jewish. It doesn't, you can still hate Jews, but appreciate and have a Jewish friend. They don't negate each other. And many anti-Semitic movements in history have represented that. That's why you could be an anti-Semite, but a Jew could come and say, I convert to Christianity, and be like, I love you, brother. Were they anti-Semites? Of course they were. They hated a part of the Jewish identity, happened to be the oral law and the rabbinic tradition that came with it. And once they got rid of that, they were okay with Jews. So it's the same thing. Once you just get rid of that sort of notion that you should be a people on your ancestral homeland, get rid of that idea, we're good. We're like, no problem. It's not going to work. It's not going to work this time. And so, like I said, how are we going to really respond to this? It has to be through education. We have to know our own stuff. Only through that can we actually go back to these people and tell them what's what. and let them say, you're not going to use me as a fig leaf. I'm not going to be sitting here for you. I don't have a problem with people that don't want to live in Israel. And I don't have a problem that people that say, I have a problem with Israel in this regard. But to say that the Jewish people don't have a right to self-determination on their own homeland, their own sovereign homeland, that we're colonialists, so we're a made-up people, and genetically we're not actually Jews, and they're replacing our ancestry that suffered for thousands and thousands of years to survive, and then to be robbed of our identity, to be stripped of our history, to be stripped of our ancestors. It's not gonna fly. It's not gonna work. And thankfully, that's the whole point. The whole point is, not only do we have a spiritual homeland and a cultural homeland, but we actually have a physical homeland, so that we can defend ourselves, and so that scum, Jew haters, there's only so much they can do now. So here's coming with a flag of Israel and Jerusalem free, and a liberated Jew saying, thank God for Zionism. Speak to you soon.